And that message was posted as a public message at that wallet address, and it read, "We are ready to pay. Contact us," followed by a link to a private web page.
"We are ready to pay. Contact us." That message sat on a public Bitcoin ledger for anyone in the world to find. Not sent quietly, not sent through a back channel. Posted in plain sight, attached to a wallet address that should never have left a police department's internal files in the first place. Somebody made a mistake. And 6 months into one of the most closely watched missing person cases in the country, that mistake tells you almost everything you need to know about how this investigation has been run. Her name is Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, mother of a national television anchor, taken from her own home in the Catalina Foothills outside Tucson sometime after 9:30 on the night of January 31st. Reported missing the next morning when she failed to show up for church. What followed was a media firestorm, a reward that climbed past $1 million, thousands of tips, and 6 months in, a sheriff's department that keeps finding new ways to make its own job harder. Start with the ransom notes. 2 of them, both addressed with details specific enough that investigators came to believe they were genuine. The first demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The second, sent later, said she had died shortly after the abduction and asked for nothing more.
Sheriff Nanos decided to publish the first 2 ransom notes. At least the notes they believe have the most credibility, tend to believe are real ransom notes from the actual kidnapper of Nancy Guthrie. The first one asked for all the money, give me $4 million by this date and $6 million by that date, or she gets it. And then the second one saying, "Oh dear, so sorry, didn't realize how sick she was, but she died shortly after we took her and we buried her with nature. And no more requests for money." So that's also probably a good key as to why it's probably real. Because if it's a scammer wants money. They're not sending notes to say, "I'm sorry she didn't survive." They're sending money requests, whether it's the first or the second or the third. And usually there's a lot of immediacy to it. But that second note didn't have any of that. So maybe that's why. Plus the details in the ransom note. Apple Watch, Nancy's Apple Watch, it's white, it's on the floor by her bed. Those are details that are very specific. And so those might be the reasons why they tend to believe those notes were real. So Sheriff Nanos decided to release both of those notes.
When the sheriff's department finally released those notes to the public at the 6-month mark, they did something almost impossible to believe. They posted the first note with the Bitcoin wallet address still visible, unredacted, in public. It didn't stay hidden for long. Online researchers found the wallet within hours, and what they found inside it was not supposed to exist in public view at all. A small deposit, apparently placed there by federal investigators testing whether the account was still active, and a message attached to the transaction. "We are ready to pay. Contact us." Followed by a link to a private page. That is the kind of operational detail that law enforcement protects at all costs, because once it's public, whoever they were trying to lure out now knows exactly what's waiting for them. The department caught the error and pulled the note down, redacted it, reposted it, but by then it had already been seen, copied, and spread. The damage does not reverse.
Man, that is stuff that just shouldn't be getting out in public, right? Now, to their credit, after they screwed up, they realized they screwed up, and the sheriff's department yanked that accidental public posting, unredacted ransom note with the Bitcoin address. They pulled it, and then they redacted it, and then they re-released it redacted. But the damage was done, and that shit was out there, right? And so now sleuthers were able to see the transaction that was actually done to try to, lure those ransom seekers out a little bit, pull them out a little bit, give them a little bit of money just to say, "Okay, we're here, and here's our message." So, look, that is dumb AF, right? Especially in something this high profile. We're at 6 months, y'all. We are at 6 months, and every single move is scrutinized. Sheriff Nanos has had the shit taken out of him on this. So you would think that every time you push send or enter or whatever, you're triple checking that the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted and that Bitcoin wallet addresses aren't there unredacted. But that happened. Yeah.
To understand how a mistake like that happens in a case with this much national attention, you have to understand the man running the investigation. Sheriff Chris Nanos has led the Pima County Sheriff's Department for a decade, appointed rather than elected the first time around. And according to Rick Castagar, his former boss of 3 decades at the department, now retired, the pattern didn't start with this case. Castagar describes a leadership style built around control. Micromanagement is so tight, he says, that experienced investigators became afraid to act without direct approval, worried about consequences if they moved without permission.
Well, I certainly see it as a significant mistake, and it continues to amaze me with the number of mistakes this case has generated coming from the Pima County Sheriff's Department. And I attribute this to the leadership of the organization. I've known and worked with Chris Nanos, the sheriff, for over 3 decades. I've seen him micromanage things to the point of creating problems on investigations. His history, interestingly enough, is really just focused on investigations. He's been there for nearly 40 years, and all he's done his entire career has been investigations, and he has a myopic scope of what a police department should run, how it should run, and what it's like. And he involves himself in minutia, and he's he's got people to the point where they're afraid to do what they know best to do because they could be, there may be repercussions. So it troubles me that this Bitcoin address was released. It creates problems for not just the Guthrie family, who now could have an onslaught of people purporting to be involved in the crime, but really have no involvement whatsoever. It takes away an element of the evidence that the investigators can use to establish the integrity of somebody they may catch someday and determine the Bitcoin address. And now it's out there. So anybody could say, that's mine. And it's problematic. I'm troubled by it. I'm embarrassed by it, Ashley, having put my life's work into that organization. And it's just another example of poor leadership.
He points to a small, almost absurd example from his own tenure. A $250 training program for corrections staff, approved and then personally overturned by Nanos, Castagar says, because of who was teaching it.
Real quick side story. You can edit this out if you want. I approved a $250 training program for the Corrections Bureau. 300-400 people would benefit from this. And it was a Zoom type of a video where they could sit down for an hour and get some, in-service training. And he heard about it, and he dismissed it and disapproved. Now, I'm number 2 in the organization. He disapproved what I had already approved. And the reason is because the guy who was going to do the teaching did not support him during his election. This was a person who said derogatory things, I guess just like what I'm doing right now, but said derogatory things about him. So Chris disapproved a $250 training program out of a tens and tens of $1 million budget that the Sheriff's Department has. He found it, and his emotions involved themselves. He found it to be dismissed the training. What does that do? That hurts 300 or 400 people who could potentially gain from that training. It's ludicrous. And it's just one example I share with you that indicates just how micromanaging he is and how he...
If that's the level of control exercised over a routine budget line, it raises an obvious question about what that same instinct does inside a homicide investigation, drawing worldwide attention. That instinct, according to Castagar, extends to Nanos' relationship with the FBI, and that relationship has a documented history. Years before this case, during a public corruption investigation into his own department, Nanos reportedly asked the FBI to keep him updated and grew angry when he felt shut out, going on local news to say, in effect, that the FBI should come to him if they wanted to learn how to run an investigation. Castagar calls it arrogant.
Well, there's a number of things that I think your viewers really don't understand with regard to the relationship with this police department and the FBI. And it really stems from its leader, Chris Nanos. A lot of folks don't know this, but back in 2016, we're talking 10 years ago, Chris was appointed as the sheriff. He didn't win the election, but somebody had to run the place, and he was appointed. And during that time, the FBI was conducting an investigation of public corruption effectively, and they are the ones who are charged with that responsibility. When a police official does something illegal or unethical, the FBI investigates. They were doing that against a couple of individuals in his department, the sheriff's department, Chris Nanos. And Chris had a relationship at the time with the FBI, and he asked them very plainly, and I was there at the time, I remember this, would you please keep me apprised of the progress of this investigation? They said they would. They didn't. He got very angry. And when I say angry, I'm talking about an individual who gets red-faced, flushed, starts to perspire, and it's just so visible, it's kind of troubling. And he became angry at the FBI. He got on the local news here and he said words to the effect, listen, if you guys, the FBI, want to know how to do a police investigation, come see me and I'll teach you how to do a police investigation. That's arrogant and it burns bridges. So Chris has had a long-standing disdain for the FBI. And certainly in this particular case, how many examples could I share with you? The blood was traipsed upon by a news media outlet. The DNA material was sent to a company in Florida who has to get their certification and training from, who else? The FBI. And why not give it to the FBI? What's really sad about this is Chris's ego has gotten in the way of, and has, in my opinion, deflated the integrity of this investigation. And it's troublesome to me. And I've been vocal about it. And some people might say I'm just a sore loser. I'm retired. I don't really have anything to gain here. But it's just sad to see.
Whatever it was, the same tension has shown up repeatedly in the Guthrie case. A fight over which lab processed the DNA evidence, criticism from the FBI director over that decision, and, according to Castagar, a task force where Pima County investigators keep tighter control over the FBI's role than he believes the case calls for. Here's what's worth sitting with for a second. This is not a small-town shoplifting case where local control makes sense. This is a woman taken from her bed. Evidence suggesting a planned abduction by someone who knew exactly where the home security camera was aimed, and a case that, by any competent standard, called for handing the reins to the agency built specifically to handle kidnappings that may cross state or international lines. Castagar says that's exactly what he would have done, starting on day 2. It did not happen that way.
I'm going to give you an opinion, and you asked me why. And it's very simple, because I know the personality. It's because I say so, I'm in charge, and you do what I tell you. That's why.
Had to have an underlying reason, though.
Well,
What do you think
there
the
is
underlying
no reason. They closed off that house multiple times and went back and searched the area multiple times and they found things after the fact. What's intriguing to me is law enforcement responds to a case like this. Somebody's missing, they're elderly, and she was infirmed. We all know that. And what we learned from the family was she was bright. She had her mental faculties in place. She was not, succumbing to any kind of mental disability. So they did the right thing by enacting a search for her. That's the correct thing to do, because that's one of the first things you do. You go outside the house, you look around the yards, the front yard, backyard, footprints, trails, wherever they might consider she could have wandered off to. Why? Because 9 times out of 10, when you're dealing with an elderly person who's missing, they've walked away. So they answered that question on a search initially. They went back and they had, as we may recall from news reports, evidence in the bedroom, unspecified, evidence on the front porch, specified, blood, and of course, eventually a ring camera, or excuse me, a Nest camera video of some guy approaching the front door. It became clear within day 2 or 3 that this was an abduction, at least to me, from the outside looking in. And yes, maybe I'm hypercritical, but it was clearly an abduction. The conclusion the sheriff's department came to was, yes, but we have to consider all possible avenues. Family's one of them. Workers, friends, neighbors, church where she went. Did somebody have some vindictive reason to do this? We don't know those things initially. It became clearer and clearer as the investigation progressed. So there were a lot of mistakes made, and as I told you just before I started speaking 2 minutes ago, I see this clearly as an egocentric decision.
And the mistakes compound. Before the Nest camera video was even discovered, the crime scene on Guthrie's own front porch was left open long enough for a news crew to film themselves standing in blood evidence. The department didn't secure that footage from a home security camera immediately either. Because the homeowner didn't have a cloud subscription, investigators initially treated the camera as a dead end, until the FBI, with the sheriff's approval, went directly to the manufacturer and recovered the footage anyway. That footage is what ultimately showed a man in gloves and a mask approaching the house, clearly aware of where the camera was pointed. Sophisticated, prepared, not an impulsive act.
You know, on that day too, I had a very high-level sheriff's source tell me that they had zeroed in on the brother-in-law and they were considering him as a prime suspect. And then we learned later on that they had seized the brother-in-law and his wife's car. They kept it for, better part of 2 months. They searched their home in the dark of night. Do you have any information from your former colleagues that was the focus of the sheriff's department early on, and that perhaps that was sort of a tunnel vision that stopped them from finding Porch Guy and everything else that we don't know today?
I'm going to address the issue of Porch Guy with you first, and then kind of come back to the idea of investigating the family members. The video that was later determined to come from a Google Nest camera was not part of the sheriff's department's consideration. As a matter of fact, they knew she had a camera out front, but she didn't have a subscription to it. In other words, the videos weren't kept in the cloud. So they dismissed any opportunity to find any video on that camera and went about the next thing. Then the next thing became, we got to look at the family. Now, cops out there who might be listening to me will understand completely. You don't rule out any potential here. And we don't know who's committed this crime. I have some theories. We can talk about that in a little bit. But it wasn't until the FBI got on board, with Chris's permission, of course, that they're the ones who went to Google and said, hey, have you deleted this stuff yet? Could we check and see? And they did. And lo and behold, here we got a bad guy, all gooned up in his attire, wearing double gloves and a mask, and walking into that porch knowing where the camera was. And I say that with emphasis because that tells me this was a sophisticated abduction. It involved people, and I think more than one, who did preparatory work to take Nancy for money. And the sheriff's department was doing what they needed to do Ashley, in look at the brother-in-law, look at the family members, look at people who.
Now, here's where the case gets harder to pin down, not easier. Investigators pursued family members early, standard practice in any disappearance, and at least one relative had a vehicle seized for close to 2 months and a home searched overnight. No charges have been filed against anyone in this case. No suspect has been publicly named, and at least one person questioned during the investigation is now pursuing legal action against the department over how that questioning was handled. Whatever happened inside that house on January 31st, the public record does not currently support pointing a finger at any specific person, and a channel built on getting this right rather than getting it first has to say so plainly. What is documented is this. 6 months later, FBI agents were seen back behind Guthrie's own property, following up on some portion of the thousands of tips the case had generated.
Can you weigh in on why, even now, 6 months later, Brian Enton from News Nation reports that the FBI was back outside of Nancy Guthrie's house, behind the house. 6 months later, what could possibly bring agents back to that scene?
Well, they're now in the process of following up on tips. And as you may recall, there were thousands of tips that came in because
Tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands. This got such widespread coverage, exposure nationally and internationally. Some of those tips may include, I'm not privy to them, but may include things that would cause law enforcement to go back and look at certain areas. You may recall, just a few weeks after she was abducted, and there was at least one ransom request, they went back to the house and they discovered gloves all around, not all around, but in various places around the property or just off the property. That's interesting. It turns out the DNA testing on those particular gloves were from the investigators or the search and rescue folks or people known to the sheriff's department to be involved in the investigation. That's sad because it's careless of an investigator to do that. It contaminates a potential crime scene, and it's problematic. But I attribute the FBI going back there just recently, in the last couple of weeks, to following up on tip number 4,612, whatever it may be. They've got to pursue this. Somebody asked me recently, do I think that this is a cold case? And the answer is absolutely not. There's so many tips they got to follow through on. And
investigators are working through DNA evidence using familial genealogy techniques, the same category of forensic tool that helped identify the Golden State Killer decades after his last known crime. Though Castagar is careful to note that an unidentified male DNA sample recovered near the scene doesn't necessarily belong to whoever took her.
Do you think then, well, I'll ask you, what is the opinion of those working in the sheriff's department that this case will ever be solved?
I believe, and so do they believe, they will solve this case. The eventuality for that is the dogged police work that they're pursuing at this point. And
so despite everything, despite all the micromanaging and the frustrations that they have, that they're not able to do their job, even now at month 6, despite all of that, they still feel confident they're going to solve the case?
They do. There's
Why?
some, and I don't know what it is. Well, there is evidence that I'm not aware of, and that's okay. I don't need to be made aware of it. But there's evidence that they're pursuing. One of them is pretty clear, and it's been intimated by the sheriff department. It has to do with genealogy and familial DNA. You've heard that technology.
Oh, sure.
And it's a fairly recent technology where you have a bit of DNA that you can't identify in what we call the DNA bank. If a bad guy got arrested 10 years ago and his DNA was entered into this bank, it's comparative with what we have in our hands today to what it was then. And it will be very specific to a person. But that technology has grown and improved over the years to include a familial element to it. So people do 23andMe and other genealogy tests on themselves, Some of that data is in another data bank, DNA data, and there are ways to take this unknown source of DNA and attribute it to a family line that might produce
The person.
a bad guy at some
Yeah.
point.
A guy
And
who may not be in the bad guy bank. I mean, that's
right,
how Brian
right,
Kohberger was
exactly,
found.
the
It's how
bad
we're
guy bank.
finding Golden State
Yeah.
Killer. However, I'm very, I don't feel as good about that. Granted, I don't know everything about that sample that they found. It's just a sample of male DNA that is not in her immediate family or friends or circle of people that she knows.
It could belong to virtually anyone who had legitimate reason to be near that property. There is a theory, and it is worth naming as exactly that, a theory, offered by a retired law enforcement veteran who is not personally working the case, based on the region's geography and nothing more concrete than that. Castagar believes Guthrie may have been taken across the border into Mexico, pointing to the area's proximity to the border and to tribal land that allows for less restricted crossing. It is a plausible read of the map.
That she was taken to Mexico, and I'll tell you why I think that. You know, we didn't have that nest video for some time, but there were a lot of clues that suggest that this was a sophisticated and prepared crime. And if you think about the geography here in southern Arizona, we're 60 miles north of Mexico. That's where Tucson rests. If some buddies, plural, decided to abduct Nancy for Savannah's and family's money, and they knew that they would have to care for an 80-plus individual with medical needs, where else would you go? You would have to know that this was going to garner national attention. And where else would you go? It's a 90-minute drive down to the Mexican border. And by the time that you get there at 1, 2, or 3 in the morning, nobody's aware that Nancy's missing at that time. You can cross into Mexico, without any concern whatsoever. One of the first things I think should have been done, and I don't, to this day, I don't know that that's happened, but I would have sent investigators down to the border and gone to each checkpoint and look at the video feed around the time zone, parameters we're looking at from her abduction, and see if a car went across with a man and an elderly lady in it. So you don't know that. And I don't know if that's happened. The FBI would be critical in attaining that because there are federal agencies involved in securing the border. There's also another little anomaly in Pima County. As I mentioned, this county is 9,200 square miles. This is a big county. And a large portion of that is juxtaposed to the Tohono O'odham Indian Reservation Nation. And they are an autonomous nation. And they have free access to and from the Mexican border. In other words, those citizens of that nation may traverse into Mexico and back into the United States unimpeded. There's no problem. They have that autonomy to do that. Could a person with a kidnapped lady in a car go down there and cross at that point? That's a 2-hour drive instead of 90 minutes down Interstate 19. So, yes, and I think that's a plausible explanation. I also think that that's a location where you're not under a microscope seeing the national attention that this thing got. Everybody in their neighborhood became aware, and if some guy's holding an older lady, they become aware of it. She's got needs. She's got medical needs. Could they be addressed in Mexico? Yeah. Could they have a locale in Mexico where they could put her? Yeah.
It is not evidence. Treat it accordingly. What the department has confirmed, publicly and repeatedly, is that the case remains open, that no one has been ruled out, and that Sheriff Nanos has said he still believes it will be solved. A deputies union has since taken a formal no-confidence vote against him. A county board has moved to require him to answer questions about the case under oath. Those are facts, not speculation, and they say as much about the state of this investigation as anything in the ransom notes. Nancy Guthrie's family is still asking the public for help. Her daughter has posted, more than once, asking anyone who recognizes the handwriting in those ransom notes, anyone who noticed something unusual about someone close to them, to come forward. 6 months in, that is still where this stands. Not solved, not closed, not cold according to the people running it, though plenty of people watching from the outside would be forgiven for wondering. If you were in that community, watching a department leak the one piece of leverage it had left, would you still trust them to bring her home? And what would it take to convince you either way? That's a real question, not a rhetorical one. Leave your answer below.